Well, ledgering for pike is a very popular method. I tend to use it for long range fishing or when I know I'm going to have to wait a long time for a bite. Some people just like ledgering just for the sake of it. It's a great method to use. I'm going to show you now how to set up your bite indication, because it's not like carp fishing. You're not going to get a steaming run when a fish hooks itself. What's going to happen is the pike's going to pick up the bait and start meandering off with it. And you need to know straight away, because if you don't strike straight away, it's going to swallow it and cause it some harm. You don't want to offer it any resistance either, because it's likely to drop the bait. So this drop arm I'm using here is the perfect solution to my bite indication. I'll show you how I've set it up. And as you can see, basically it's an arm that just drops when you get a bite. It's important that you clip it to your rear rod rest lower than the reel, because you want to see it drop down. It's also important that you clip your line in just at the back of the spool for the best efficiency, so it doesn't keep pulling out at the wrong time. So I've got the clip in the right position. I've adjusted the rod on the rod rest, and that's going to clip up just behind the back of the spool. So after casting, open the bail arm, line in the clip. Now that clip is adjustable for different thicknesses of line. And now, for maximum efficiency, I want that right up against the reel. Needs a little bit of care, but once you've done it a few times, you'll be very quick at doing it. And the only other thing I want to think about now, I don't know whether you saw that, but what's happened there, it wants adjusting because this line's quite thin. Right, I've tightened it up to allow for this thin line. Right, that's perfect now. Now the only other thing I want to adjust is the sensitivity. Now there's a sliding weight on the arm, and if I want to make it really sensitive, I'll bring the weight forward. It's putting a lot of tension on the bobbin, and the slightest pull and that will be out. If that's causing problems, false alarms, I'll just slide it back a bit. So there it is, it's all set up to get a run. Now with this style of fishing you can get two types of run. You get the normal full-blooded run where the line just pulls out and the bobbin drops, and there's no mistaking that's a bite. The pike's not feeling any resistance there, it's a free line, so you just pick up the rod and strike. But something else can happen when you're ledgering. You can get what we call a drop back bite. And this happens when the pike brings the rig towards you and makes the line go slack. And it's still really important to strike immediately, but this is set up now to give indication of a slack line bite. If the line goes slack, you'll see the arm drops. And if it's not dropping properly, you might want to bring the weight forward just to put a bit more weight on the end of the arm. And that is a sign to strike. If that arm drops back, the pike's moved towards you and you must strike. So that's it, you can use it on its own, or if you want extra bite indication, you can use it in conjunction with the front alarm. So there it is, quite simple and a really efficient setup for ledgering for pike. I like to keep my dead baiting for pike as simple as I can. There's no point complicating things. And one of my favourite methods is a simple float fish dead baiting. And I've got one set up here now, I'm just about to cast it in. But choice of float can be confusing, so why have I ended up with this float today? Well, for me a float does two things. First of all, it's visual indication that the pike has taken your bait, and that's when I'm fishing the bait on the bottom. But if I want to fish the bait off the bottom, it's got to be suitable for suspending that bait. So there it is, the dead baiting float does two things. I've chosen this one for today and I'm going to fish the bait on the bottom. But now I'll take you through some other floats and show you what we can do with them. Well, as you can see today, I am a man of many floats. And when you go into a tackle shop, you will see lots of different floats, and that'll probably confuse you. But don't be confused, because it's pretty straightforward. Once you've done a bit of fishing, finding the one that suits the way you're fishing at the time. Now, the way I'm fishing at the moment, mainly fishing dead baits on the bottom. That's the one I use most of the time. And it's got the line going straight through it. So I can use it for bite indication when it's laid flat. But if I decide I want to fish a bait off the bottom, then I just alter my stop knot, and that will support the bait. And within the Fox range, there are different weights to balance the different sizes of floats. But sometimes that float won't be enough to support the bait that I'm using. So we've got these fatter ones. These are much more chunky. These are stubby floats. Again, the line goes through, and if you want to, you can still fish the bait on the bottom. It's quite versatile. And then if you're having trouble seeing your float, you should look at the stubby slider that's got the vane on the top. Now, this will support your bait, but it'll be very visual as well. And if you need to, as I say, it's up to you what you do with your floats. You can still fish your bait on the bottom and have it lying flat or half cocked. So those are the main floats I'm using at the moment. So we've looked at the floats with the line through the centre, and I use them much of the time with the dead baiting I'm doing at the moment. But sometimes you want a lot more sensitivity, and I'm thinking of times when the water's very cold and the pike are really fiddling around with baits. Sometimes they've been fished for a lot and they're very fussy about picking up baits. Or you might be fishing very close to a snag and you need to know very quickly that you've got to take. So in those situations, I use floats where the line only goes through the bottom, through a swivel at the bottom, and that makes them very sensitive. You can tighten down to them, get them to cock, and then the slightest movement on the bait from the pike, it will give you an indication as the buoyancy in the float makes the float come up and tip on its side. So, having established the need for a sensitive float, let's look at some of the ones I use. This is my all-time favourite, the pencil float. It's an unloaded float, so when you cast it out, it just lays flat on the surface. But when you tighten down to your bait, it'll stand up and it'll stand in the water like so. All you'll see is the bright orange visual part at the top. And this is what I like about it. It's really magic when the pike picks up the bait and it just comes up out of the water and lays flat and waggles around, and then it ultimately slides away. The pike's only got to look at the bait with this float, and believe me, you'll get some indication. That is my all-time favourite dead baiting float. But sometimes you want a float that does that, gives you that sensitivity, but you want a bit more visibility. You might be fishing at long range or in bad weather, so I like to use one of these vane floats or dart floats, whatever you want to call them. And once again, you tighten down to them in the same way so that they stand up in the water. As soon as the pike picks up the bait, it lays flat and then eventually wanders off and disappears. And the last one I want to show you is the loaded float. Now, when you cast this one in, it's already standing up in the water, and that's quite sensitive, but you can make it even more sensitive by tightening down to it and pulling it down in the water, so you've just got a bit of the tip showing. And again, when the pike picks up the bait, it's not going to be quite as sensitive as the unloaded float, but it will come up in the water, and if you're watching it, you'll know you've got a bite. Now, I tend to use that one when I'm fishing very close to a snag and I'm watching it all the time and I need to know the pike's picked up the bait and I'm going to strike. So we've seen line through floats and we've seen floats with the line just going through the bottom, and you'll probably be interested to know we get them in lots of different sizes as well. Gives you a bit more sensitivity, or you might want to use them for smaller predator species like zander, perch, or even predatory chub. So that's all the floats that we've got on offer. There's an amazing range to choose from, but my tip would be buy a lot of floats and try them out, because until you've tried them, you'll never find out what really suits the fishing you're doing at the moment. So have fun and catch a few pike. I'm going to take a look now at hooking a dead bait. First of all, we should look at the size of the dead bait. Now, a lot of pike anglers might think that's a fairly small bait. It's about 7 inches long, but in all honesty, that's what I use most of the time. And the reason being that when you use bigger baits, especially a lot bigger, you can miss them on the strike. You can have fish coming off as they throw them out. I found about 7 to 8 inches is a really good size, a good compromise, easy to cast, and you get a very good strike, efficient strike from it. So where do you put the hooks? Well, there's 2 things to consider when you're putting the hooks in. First of all, they've got to be in firm enough to take the cast. You don't want them flying off the hook. And secondly, they've got to be in a position to give an efficient strike when you pick up the rod and strike straight away. Well, putting the hooks in couldn't be any simpler, really. I put them in the tail end first, and the reason for that is most of the time the pike will see the bait, it'll pick it up and it'll turn it and it'll swallow it head first. And if the hooks are in the tail end, they're facing the right way to get an efficient strike. But it's important, if you want to get a good cast, to get that top hook into the bone in the wrist of the tail if you can. Make sure it's really firm. That's the one that's taking most of the pressure when you're casting. And just 1 point goes in there. If you're using semi-barbless hooks, obviously the point with the barb goes into the fish. Now, people vary on the way they put the second treble in. A lot of people will just put 1 point in like that. You can argue all day longer which is the best way, but my view is that the pike can tip that over, it can move. So I like to make sure that 2 of the points are in and that one is fixed really solid. That's not going to move once the pike grabs hold of it. And then final test, that's really solid, that's going to cast a long way. And when the pike picks it up, the hooks are the right way round for you to make an efficient strike. So there it is. There's nothing really very difficult about it at all. You know, for much of the time when I'm dead baiting, I'm fishing the dead bait on the bottom. But there are times when I do like to get the dead bait up in the water. It might only be a foot off the bottom, it might be mid-water, it might be under the surface. But there are times when a bait drifting around gets you a lot more takes than when it's static on the bottom. And the rig really is very simple, because all it is the same rig that I'm using for dead baiting on the bottom, except that I've moved the stop knot to get the bait up off the bottom. Now at the moment here I'm fishing in 8 foot of water. I've set the stop knot to 6 feet, and I know that float will suspend that mackerel 2 foot off the bottom. And it's great, I can cast it out, I can let the wind drift it around, or if there's no wind I can slowly retrieve it. It might not work today because it's a very cold day, but on the days when the pike are really active, you cover a lot of water with this method, and believe me, it really works. It's a great method. Well, I've been using this rig myself for more years than I dare to tell you. But for those of you who find this is new, I'll just quickly run through the rig. I've got a stop knot here, which is set at the depth I want, at the moment 6 feet. I've got a bead that slides up to the stop knot. And then I've chosen a float that I think is suitable to support the bait. If that doesn't support it and the bait pulls it under, then I'll put a bigger float on. And then down the line at the business end, I've just got a quick change weight. I think that will be enough to cock the float and support the bait, but I've got the option of adding a lighter or a smaller one. And then at the end of the main line, I've tied on a quick change clip, and I've just clipped on a regular Fox 2 hook, 2 treble trace, and I've hooked a mackerel on it. So it's pretty straightforward. but obviously if you're not used to this sort of thing, I think it's worth running through it for you. So let's get it in the water, see if we can catch one. Well, I've cast the rig out and I've let it settle for a few minutes. And what I would normally do is just lift the rod, just ease the float back towards me, all the time feeling for that thump on the line when a pike grabs it. Personally, I don't think it's going to work today. It's too cold for this method, but I think it's worth showing you, and if you're out using this method on a mild day when the pike are active, it'll catch you a lot of fish. The colder the water, the slower you move it. When the water's warmer, you can move it quite quickly. And under the right conditions, I would be bringing this in quite quick. 3 or 4 casts in the swim, and then I'd be on to the next swim. And you can cover a lot of water that way. It's a great method. So what's the KEBAB rig all about? Well, it's a method I devised many years ago for catching catfish. And the thinking behind it is that I'm presenting them with a small bait, but it's absolutely dripping and oozing with body fluids and blood. And you know, when I tried it out for catfish, I found I was catching loads and loads of pike on it. And since then I've took it to lots of different waters and I've caught a lot of pike on it. And it's not the answer to every pike fishing problem. It's a different way of presenting a dead bait. And all I could say is, if you don't believe in it, next time you go, try fishing it on one rod. And I think before too long, you'll gain the confidence, because you'll be catching fish and you'll find it really does work. So what goes into the KEBAB rig? Well, imagine you've just brought a bait in, it's not much use for anything else, it's all squashed up, but it's still dripping with body fluids and blood and juices. That's still a great pike bait if you can present it nicely. Of course you could just hook it on 2 trebles if you wanted to, but I like to make it a lot more compact and more efficient for striking. So I've cut up such a dead bait. I've got all these chunks, and I'm going to put them onto the KEBAB rig now and show you how I do it. The main part of the KEBAB rig is this pin. It's got a very sharp point on the end, and all you do is just impale the chunks onto the pin. I always start with the biggest chunk first, and then the chunks get smaller and smaller until you get to the end where you're going to put the hook. And the reason for that is so that the smaller chunks don't mask the hook for the strike. Now here I've just got a regular 1 hook trace, size 4 treble, and I'm just going to put one of the points through the hole at the end of the pin, and to make sure it doesn't come off, I'm going to use a bait saver. Now that there, it probably doesn't look like the sort of thing you'd normally cast out for pike, but believe me, I do, and it really works. And that is just oozing, as you can see, with blood and juices. And you can take my word for it or not, but pike love that sort of presentation. And well, maybe I should show you something else, because you might say, well, the water where I'm fishing is very weedy. That's going to get lost in the weed. Well, just like you'd pop up any bait, you can slide a bait popper onto the pin and then put your chunks on, like so. It's not fussy how you put them on, just put them on any way you like, as long as they're dripping with blood. Connect to the treble hook, bait saver to stop them coming off, and now when you cast that out into a weedy swim, it will stand up in the weed. And as I keep saying, don't take my word for it, I know it works, just give it a try.